Good afternoon, everybody. Boa tarde para quem fala português. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Alicia Gomez. I'm a PhD candidate in public health nutrition at the School of Public Health, University of São Paulo, Brazil. And I'm also a visiting researcher at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Ontario Tech University here in Canada. This webinar was carefully planned and organized by one of our speakers today, right, Kamila? In case you didn't know that already, this webinar is part of her efforts in disseminating the knowledge she's been acquiring during her time here in Canada under a scholarship granted by the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP. For today's webinar, we propose a discussion about tools to measure adherence to Brazilian and Canadian dietary guidelines with focus on screeners towards food practices. It's been a long way, and since nutrition science moved from just calculating intake of micro and micronutrients, and now the way that we buy, the way that we cook, and the way that we eat our meals, including the people that we share our meals with, have become crucial indicatives of the type of diets that we are having. We have great presenters to explore this topic. So if you're watching this webinar and should you have any questions or comments, please take advantage of the fact that we have such good experts in this webinar. You could write your questions and comments on the box in the YouTube channel. And we also have our screen from the University of São Paulo, and Professor Patricia Jaime is there to help us moderate the questions. And for my fellow Brazilians, por favor, sintam-se à vontade para escrever as perguntas ou comentários em português, que a gente vai tentar o melhor possível na hora de traduzir tanto a pergunta quanto a resposta. Okay? So to start our discussion, we have the pleasure to invite Dr. Maud Perrault. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition at the Université de Montréal, and a researcher at the Centre Jean-Jacques Gaultier in Montreal, Quebec. Prior to this, Dr. Perrault completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Guelph Family Health Team under the mentorship of Dr. Jess Haynes at the University of Guelph. During that time, she worked on the validation of the Canadian Eating Practices Screener to assess eating practices based on the 2019 Canada's Food Guide recommendations. So we have a lot to learn from her. Please, Dr. Perrault, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I will get ready. Confirming you can see the screen. It's great, perfect. Thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to present our work, which has been surrounding the eating practices screener and the new focus that the Canada's Food Guide incorporated in the latest version of the guide. So as Alicia said, it's kind of nice to see these kind of recommendations to be in public health recommendation on a national level. Canada's Food Guide now state for the first time that food is more than nutrition is more than the food we eat. It's also the social dimension. So when, where, why, and how we eat. And that brings us to the eating practices and how that impacts healthy eating. And for the first time, there's languages around that in the guidelines for professionals, but also to the public in Canada. So things like a mindful approach to eating can promote attentive eating, which is achieved when distraction are at a minimum. Eating with others can bring enjoyment to healthy eating and can foster connections between generations and between cultures. And then preparing and eating food in the company of others is an opportunity for people of all ages to learn about the food and share food cultures. So not only that's exciting to see, but also it gives us the opportunity to design and validate a tool that we name the Canadian Eating Practices Screener that aim to measure these practices. And that's going to be the focus of today. So specifically in Canada's food guide and the recommendation that accompany the snapshot kind of plate image you might be familiar with, we have these eating habits that we aim to capture in our screener. And I should say from the beginning that this work was done closely in collaboration with Health Canada, which is the agency behind Canada's food guide. So some of the way we've designed things and approached the situation was also informed by them. So the eating habits are the ones listed on the screen, and those are the ones we aim to capture in a screener. So things like be mindful of your eating habits, take time to eat, notice when you're hungry and when you're full, cook more often, plan what you eat, and involve others in planning and preparing meals. Enjoy your food. Culture and food traditions can be part of a healthy eating, and then eat meals with others. In addition to these eating habits, we were instructed to also measure these two food recommendations. So not necessarily habits, but they were also part of the screener. So use food labels and be aware that food marketing can influence your choices. So we add this as kind of our basis of what we wanted to measure with the screener. And then our objectives were to develop and validate a brief self-administered screener to assess these eating practices based on the 2019 Canada's Food Guide. So we wanted to do this in English and in French, which are our two official languages, and we wanted the whole methods or the whole approach to be done in English and done in French. So we didn't want to have it in English and then translate it in French. We really wanted it to be like standalone methods for each of the language, which comes with a bit of a different culture in depending on the language. We targeted adults 18 to 65 years of age. Canada's Food Guide captured a more broad age range, but that was the age group that Health Canada was interested in as a first step. And then we obviously wanted the screener to be easy to administer, but also easy to score. So to do that, we did kind of two steps. The first one was to develop and test the face and content validity of the screener. And the second step was to measure the construct validity. And I've put the references. We are in the process of publishing these results, which is very exciting. So you have them here, but they're not yet accessible. So we'll start with the first step, which was the development of the eating practices screener. So obviously it was a big team effort. I won't take all the credit. Many people were involved, including our team members, and as you will see, a panel of experts who really helped in designing and refining as we go. So we first defined the foundational principle for the tool, and we use different inputs. So we use the Canada's Food Guide, obviously, the recommendation for the health practitioner, existing tools that we could find in the literature, and then expert judgment. So our panel of advisors were also really involved and helpful in refining what we would put in our first draft of the screener. Second step, part of it was a scan of the literature to really see which items we wanted to include in the screener. So we ended up with a first draft screener that involved 102 items that we needed to evaluate to see obviously which one were the most relevant in capturing the items of interest with the food guide. The third step was to then examine content validity. So from the 102 items, we narrowed down to 38 items, and those were evaluated. So again, we had an expert advisory committee who helped, and also Government of Canada employees who also had input on what was relevant or not. And that finally led us to a 21 item screener. And that's the one that we moved forward to the face validity steps. And that was done, as I said, both in English and in French at the same time with different sub-teams who obviously were native speakers. We then move on to the cognitive interviewing with adults that were aged between 18 and 65 years of age to really test the validity. So for the face validity, we did the cognitive interviewing with that group, and we really wanted to see if members of the target population interpreted the items and gave answers that were of interest and intended to act the way that we had designed the screener. If not, obviously we would do modification, and I will explain how we approach this to really make sure what we captured is what we intended to. In terms of method, we use the think aloud method as well as probing, asking participants to think aloud, kind of explain their reasoning as they were interpreting the question, and also explain further their answers, and probing when adequate. In terms of recruitment, for the English cognitive interviewing, we use social media posts. And in terms of the French one, the French team we worked with had some contacts. So we used their mailing list for their research institute, as well as some community organization who were helpful in recruiting participants. So we ended up with a sample of 32 participants. Half of it was in the French group, half of it was in the English group. And we were really successful in having a bit of a spread in terms of gender, ethnicity, and education as well. Obviously, we're trying to have diversity so we can have a representation of people living in Canada. That's always a challenge. So trying to have a diversity is really what we try to do. And I think we did well here with both education, which can be a proxy of health literacy or even reading literacy, and gender, obviously, which is always tend to be geared towards more women participating. So the cognitive interviews were done in 3 rounds for each language. And the idea was that we were rewarding items as needed. We also added and removed items if we felt like they were not performing well in that language. So that's just an overview of what happened at each round. But at the end of the 3rd round, we were pretty confident in the screener we had, and also the language closely matched. So the content of both were very similar, which was encouraging as well. Some example of the items that we modified based on the results from participants in the cognitive interview. So we had a question that asked, I set aside time to eat, and then participants were to rank the frequency. And people did not fully understand what was meant by set aside time. Some people interpreted it as always eating at the same time or being rigid with the number of minutes used to eat, when really we wanted to just capture the fact that they kind of pause and eat and enjoy their meal in a mindful way. So we rephrased that to, I take time to eat my meals, and that seemed to perform much better for participants. The second one relates to culture. So we had an item that was worded as, I eat foods that are part of my culture and or food traditions. And that didn't really perform well in the French cognitive interviewing. Interestingly, most French people who participated, and even in the subsequent step of the projects, were white, and the term culture didn't resonate with them. So we switched that, and we then said, I eat foods that are part of my family food traditions and our culture. And the family food tradition seems to resonate more with people. They seem to have ideas of what that meant, versus culture, which for them, it's not that they don't have culture, but that word didn't resonate with them. It seems to be more problematic in French than in English, which is always interesting to contrast. The third one, we had an item that said, I use nutrition information and food labels when deciding which foods and or drink to buy. And that generated a lot of discussion as to if they were foods that people were used to buying, so foods that were part of their repertoire, versus a new food for which they might be more tempted to read the label to first kind of get a sense of what the food is. So we made that clear in the item, and then we say, I use nutrition information on food labels when buying foods and or drinks for the first time. So these are just examples of kind of what happened and how we ended up with the items we have in our screener. I won't list them all, but we have here on the slide some examples of the items that we have included. And on the left-hand panel in kind of red, you have all the items, or rather the eating practices recommendation from the food guide. And then in bracket underneath each, you have the number of items that relate to that recommendation in our screener. So for example, be mindful of your eating habits. That's the wording in Canada's food guide. In the screener, we have 6 items, and one of them is, I take time to eat my meals. Each of these items are assessed on a 5-point Likert scale. So again, trying to aim for not being too burdensome on participants. So we have from never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always, and then they are coded accordingly. And with this 21 item screener, that we've developed and for which we were confident in the face validity, we then moved to the construct validity assessment, which was the 5th step in our process. So we aim to measure different things to kind of be confident in the construct validity of the screener. We wanted to see if obviously we had sufficient variance among individuals who would complete the screener. And we also wanted to see if the screener could distinguish between subgroups who we expected would have differences in eating behaviors. So men versus women, or younger versus older adults, that we didn't have a lot of evidence for all of these subgroups, but we know from, for example, the food intake literature that typically these groups tend to be different. So we kind of extrapolated some of those for the eating behaviors, and others there were evidence that these groups would be different. So we were hoping to capture that in the screener. We also measure reliability. So we look at correlations between the screener items, and we measured the consistency, internal consistency with the coefficient alpha, Cronbach's alpha. So to do that, we did a convenience sample, again, in English and in French, standalone methods, where we invited participants to complete an online survey. We recruited them through social media, and that happened between July and December 2021. And then they were invited to complete a demographic questionnaires, obviously consent, and then the screener itself. So here is the snapshot of the demographics for the construct validity survey. So we have 153 participants, a little bit more in English, so 94 participants in English, 59 in French. And here the diversity, some variables you'll see is not as great as we had hoped, despite having some quotas for recruitment. It's mostly women, 74% were women. A good distribution between age groups. So we kind of try to capture the whole range between 18 to 65 years of age. A bit more people with a university graduate degree. And then in terms of ethnicity, 59% were white. And when you look at the French kind of subgroup to the right, 81% were yes, French, but white. So obviously in terms of diversity there, it's not as we had hoped for, but I think that's always a challenge. So a bit more diversity in the English group. I will walk you through the result. And first we looked at the variance between individual on the total score. So again, as a reminder, we had 21 items. They were all measured on a 5-point Likert scale, and the total score could range from 21 to 105. There were some questions that were reverse coded. So where someone who said always doing a behavior was actually giving them less points than others, the majority were frequency of doing that behavior was coded higher. So when we looked at the screener items, all the items had a response range between 1 and 5 or 2 and 5, so 2, 5. So that's good. That's what we hope to see, right? Like a range in the type of behaviors people do. And then when we looked at the total sample, so the total score, and that's what you see in the bottom table, the mean score was quite high at 76 points out of 105, and the standard deviation was 8. So it's quite high. There's still variance, so we were confident with that. And looking at the percentiles, we still see a range, like variance from the first percentile being 53 and 99 percentile being 92. But obviously, we seem to be skewed a little bit more on the higher end. When looking at the differences between subgroups with hypothesized differences, we saw a significant difference in the total score between subgroups for the variable of language, age, smoking status, and education. So for those people who were French, 35 to 65 years of age, non-smoker, and who had a university degree tend to score higher. And in terms of gender, we did not see a difference between genders. So women and men tend to have the same score. So that was surprising, might be due to the fact that most of our samples were women, but still interesting to note. We then look at the correlations between the screener items. So the Pearson correlation ranged from minus 0.14 to 0.63. And some of the items who were similar in terms of their construct they were measuring tend to correlate better together, which was not surprising and encouraging to see. And if you remember at the beginning, I said we were measuring also two food choices kind of items that were not necessarily behavior, like be aware that marketing can influence your choice. So these tend to be the one that sometimes were not correlated as strongly with the rest of the items. The item total score correlations range from 0.19 to 0.62. So we observed moderate correlation. And again, here, the example of the lowest correlation was the I am aware that food advertisement can make me want to eat or drink, which again is not really a behavior. It's more kind of like a belief or a state, versus the strongest correlation was at 0.62. When I have the opportunity, I eat my meals with others. The Kronzbach coefficient alpha was 0.79, so that was really great and deemed acceptable. And then the conclusion that we felt comfortable doing was that among a sample of adults, the screener was found to be internally consistent, to demonstrate reasonable variations in scores, and to also distinguish among some groups with expected differences in eating practices. There are considerations specifically for the scoring. First, we designed this and validated this as a 21 item tool. So we really hope people will use it because we don't want to pull questions or items and measure just that construct. That's really not how we validated and constructed that tool. So it's really to be meant to use as a 21 item tool to measure the alignment with Canada's food guide, specifically on the eating practices. And similarly, and I know some people are a bit uncomfortable with this, but there's no cut points. So we cannot say above this score, it means X, Y, Z. It's really that a higher score indicate more eating practices that align with Canada's food guide recommendations. Future step could look at, designing cutoff points to, say that X score means whatever, but for now we don't have a cut point. So really we just want people to go in knowing that fact. In terms of concluding statement and also future direction, I think again, it's great to see in national guidelines that healthy eating is more than just the food we eat. And I think that the next step could be to explore how the eating practices are associated with other outcomes that relate to the well-being. So not just food intake or diet quality, but things like relationship with food, relationship with body image, and even social connection and well-being. I will extend the thank you for everyone who's here, listening, engaging. Obviously, our partner work really closely with us at the University of Waterloo and all of our advisory board members and Health Canada for their input throughout the process, which you can expect is long, and I appreciate everyone's willingness and dedication to the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mold. That was a lot of information, and we started with our questions. Is it okay if we if I present those questions now, or do you prefer
Sure.
at the end? Yeah, okay.
That's good.
So Anthony Aquino R asked, how is possible the comparability with other health eating index with the screening tool?
So if we can compare ours to the healthy eating index.
Yeah.
So we, well, if you're aware or not, but in Canada, they, based on the same food guides, they designed other screeners to measure adherence to the food intake, and also kind of a screener that would resemble to the, I think it's called the eating index in the US. And we tried kind of preliminary analysis of if we could see correlation between the eating practices, what we measure with our screeners, and the food intake, using the tools that they designed for the same population. It wasn't too conclusive and it was preliminary, so I wouldn't advance too much on that and what it means. I think first it's two different things, kind of what we've been saying, right? The eating practices doesn't necessarily equate to food quality or diet quality. And I don't know if we can make that assumption that it will always correlate, and perhaps one can be high and the other not, and it's not a bad thing necessarily. But I think that would be interesting to see if they correlate and if we can make any kind of conclusion from these screeners. So I don't have a clear answer, but I share kind of the interest in knowing if that link exists.
Great, thank you. Thank you for answering that. So if anyone else has any other questions about Dr. Moult's presentation, please keep writing that on the YouTube chat. But in the meantime, we will move over to our Brazilian side. So I'd like to hand it over to Kamila Gabe. She is a nutritionist and a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health at the University of São Paulo. And currently, she is in Canada for a research internship in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Her interests lie in food-based dietary guidelines, implementation and evaluation, food and nutrition literacy, and dietary assessment. So Kamila, please, your presentation.
Okay, let me know if something not shared properly. Alicia already introduced me, so I can skip this part of presentation. What I'm going to present today is part of my PhD research, which in turn is continuity of my master's. I've been working with this subject since 2016. Both my master and PhD under the supervision of the Professor Patricia Jaime, which is moderating our discussion in the in-person room today. I will present an overview of the process we went through to develop and validate a scale to measure the adherence to food practices recommended by the dietary guidelines for the Brazilian population, which has most of its messages based on food practices. But I will also bring a particular focus on some of new results of my PhD, where we analyzed the association between the adherence to these food practices and diet quality. So it's kind of bring some thoughts to the question that a participant made about Maud's presentation. So starting with a bit of background, the Ministry of Health released a new Brazilian dietary guidelines in 2014. And this updated version was a breakthrough compared to the previous version from 2006. One of the innovations of these guidelines was to have adopted recommendations based on the level of food processing using the NOVA classification framework. I believe most of people in this audience are familiarized with NOVA, but just to bring a short description of the NOVA food groups that base the main recommendations of our dietary guidelines. So I'm showing here a picture from the guide where it shows 3 of the 4 NOVA food groups. And the first group is represents the group 1 of NOVA classification, which is composed by foods that receive none or only a minimal industrial processing. Here we have, as an example, a pineapple. The third group of NOVA classification, the processed foods, it's basically a combination of foods from the first group with salt, oil, or sugar. So this combination done in another under industrial process made foods that we call processed foods. And the last and the highest level of processing of NOVA classification are the ultra processed foods, which are basically formulations made basically from substances extracted from natural foods, and they have basically nothing of a natural food inside. And in general, they have a long list of ingredients. Most of them are cosmetics to make them more palatable and attractive. So the food guide has a main recommendation that summarizes the recommendations based on our classification, which is called the Golden Rule, which is always prefer fresh and minimally processed foods and freshly made dishes and meals to ultra-processed foods. Another novelty of the Brazilian food guide was that most of its messages are focused on food practices rather than quantities or number of portions of specific foods, to make the message more feasible and easier to understand for the general public. So according to the literature, food practices can be defined as a network of daily activities connected to the act of eating, such as food shopping, cooking, sharing meals, meals planning, social life. And here are some of the messages that we can find on the food guide, and they are supposed to be more aligned with a healthier food intake in accordance with what the Golden Rule says. So in the examples here, we can see shop in places that offer a variety of natural or minimally processed foods. Plan your time to make food and eating important in your life, and develop exercise and share cooking skills. But with this innovation of the guideline also brought a challenge, which was how to measure the adherence to these qualitative messages. So considering this non-quantitative nature of these messages in the guideline, we developed a scale using psychometric methodologies. So the process is similar to the one that Maud presented for the Canada's tool. So basically, we went through this sequence of steps, starting with the development of a pool of items. So we went through all the recommendations of the food guide and selected the recommendations, and then developed short sentences based on these recommendations to address the adherence to these messages. Then we submitted this pool of initial items to content and face validity through an experts panel and pretest with potential users of the scale. And here we invited people from users of a private healthcare service in Brazil. Then we run dimensionality tests using factor analysis, exploratory and confirmatory, to see which dimensions of healthy eating were covered by the tool, by that set of items that we had. Then we also did test-retest, comparing scores in 2 points of times in a sample of adults in Brazil. We also did conversion validity, comparing the scores in a scale to scores on dietary intake. And lastly, we also run invariance analysis, which is a type of factor analysis to compare if the scores or if the psychometric properties of the scale were comparable between sociodemographic subgroups. So from this process, we got in a final version of the scale with 4 dimensions, which are planning, eating modes, domestic organization, and food choices. There's 24 items in the scale and 4 options of response. So for each of them, people need to choose between never, rarely, often, or always. And here I put down 1 item per dimension to exemplify. So for planning, I usually carry some food with me in case I get hungry during the day. For eating modes, I deal with personal issues during mealtime, and therefore I usually ended up not eating anything. For domestic organization, we share tasks which involve the preparation and consumption of food at home. And for food choices, I usually take sandwiches or savory snacks for lunch or dinner instead of freshly homemade dishes. I didn't mention before, but this scale was also developed in a partnership between our group in Brazil, the Center for Epidemiological Research in Nutrition and Health, and the Ministry of Health. So because of that, Ministry of Health have been using this scale for health promotion purposes. So we can find the tool within the Connect SUS app, which is an app from our healthcare system in Brazil, the SUS. And people can download the app, complete the scale, and have a score with some messages on how to improve, the diet. And also there's this folder, which is a printed folder, also with the items and how to sum the score and with some messages on healthy eating. Having said that, messages based on food practices have been adopted in many national food guides. So besides Brazil, there's Canada, Japan, Uruguay that also have messages based on food practices. And I'm gonna, as I said in the beginning, I'm gonna focus on some results of my research when we analyzed if the adherence to these food practices are associated with a healthier dietary intake. So to answer this question, we run a cross-sectional analysis within the NutriNet Brazil cohort study, which is an ongoing web-based cohort study coordinated by Nupens, by our group in Brazil. People anyone who lives in Brazil is at least 18 years old and has access to internet can participate. And the participation consists in completing quick questionnaires that are sent every 3 months, including a web-based 24-hour dietary call using a tool that we call Nova 24-hour tool, which was developed especially for this study. And for this analysis in particular, we selected a subsample of 2,052 participants. And this subsample was based on codes by sex, education, and macroregion. These people were notified to complete the food practices scale. And also they had completed as part of the NutriNet Brazil cohort study, the Nova 24-hour call. And we selected the people that had completed at least 1 and up to 3. So to measure diet quality, we calculate the usual percentage intake of, the usual percentage of total energy intake from 10 food groups using the multiple source method. So we selected these food groups based on the food guide recommendations. So we wanted to see if the food practice adherence was related to those messages focus on food groups in our guide. So we classified these groups in eating more, limiting, and avoiding based on what the guide says. In the category eating more, we have plant-based fresh foods, which is basically the first group of Nova classification, except for not including meats and dairy and eggs. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and beans and other legumes. In the limiting category, we have processed foods, table sugar, red meat. And in avoiding category, we have the whole group of ultra-processed foods. So we analyzed how the food practices score, the score in the scale was associated with the usual intake of each one of these food groups. Oh, sorry. With which one of these food groups using crude and adjusted linear regression models. So we run independent models to which one of these food groups. And we adjusted the models for sex, age, macroregion, education, ethnicity, and being vegan or vegetarian, only for the analysis involving the intake of red meat. So here is how the distribution of the score in the food practices scale looks like in the sample. So we can see that it has kind of symmetric distribution, and it looks like a normal distribution. It ranged in this sample from 9 to 70. The mean was 43, and the median was 44. So it looks like a normal distribution. And here, for this analysis that I mentioned before, we classify this score in quartiles. So this is the range within which quartile. So in quartile 1, it varied from 9 to 38, quartile 2, 39 to 44, 3, 45 to 50, and 51 to 70. Here I'm showing how the usual intake of these food groups change according to the quartiles of the score on the food practices scale. So we can see here this light green is the quartile 1 in the scale, while the dark green is the quartile 4. So for all the food groups in the eating more category, we can see a clear trend of increasing from the lower to the highest adherence to the food practices for all the food groups. For the limiting food groups category, this trend is clear only for table sugar here. And there is a difference between the streams categories for processed foods between the quartile 1 and quartile 4. But for red meat, this association was not significant. We can see in the 4 quartiles, the usual intake in terms of percentage of energy, it's quite similar. And again, for ultra-processed foods, the trend is very clear. So the intake of ultra-processed foods among those with a high adherence to the food practices score, it's around 70% of the energy comes from ultra-processed foods, while among those 25% with the lowest adherence to the food practices, the intake of ultra-processed foods is almost 30% of the total energy intake. So bringing already some conclusions to wrap up my presentation. In general, we see that the adherence to the food practices recommended by the Brazilian Food Guide is associated with a healthier dietary intake. These findings reinforce previous evidence supporting the validity of the food practices scale, since they indicate that the practices measured through the scale are markers of a healthier food intake. Regarding the results for the red meat group, it's important to consider that this item is an important item from the traditional Brazilian dietary pattern. So maybe other strategies are needed to communicate this recommendation, or they are not directly measured through the food practice because red meat, it's always consumed. We have studies in Brazil showing that this item is consumed normally with rice and beans, which are strongly recommended in the food guide. So maybe a break of this pattern is necessary to improve or to reduce the intake of red meat in Brazil. And also our results call attention for the importance of policies to enable healthier food practices and reducing barriers for a healthier diet, such as lack of time, poor food literacy and culinary skills, and unhealthy food environments. So here we have some examples of the contradictions of our food environment in Brazil. And here is a picture of our traditional PF, which is a combination, like our main traditional meal in Brazil, like a combination of rice, beans, and meat, as I mentioned. I would like to thank you for everyone that is here attending this webinar. And I focus more, like we already have been working with this scale since 2016. So we have some publications focused on all those steps that I mentioned that we went through to develop. And that's why I focus more on this association between the score and the diet quality. And I'm happy to answer any questions that the audience might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamila. I'm still smiling. Yeah,
I'm still
smiling.
sharing. All
Yeah,
right,
it
I already stopped.
Yeah,
I stopped. Okay.
yeah. I'm just still smiling because now I've seen the PF and I've been in Canada for more than 6 months, and that gave me an immense crave for that. So thank you. Okay, so from the chat from the YouTube, Dr. Mold, we received a question here for you from Marcia Hira. It asked, like, do you know which percentage of the Canadian population knows the CDG, Canadian Dietary Guidelines? But I just want to expand on that question more than just knowing the guidelines. How are those guidelines inserted in public policies in general, or the health system? Because in Brazil, our food guide it's an enormous reference for many other instruments and public policy. So if you could expand on that question, please.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And listening to Kamila, I was thinking when you presented the app, how cool that is, and how we do not have this in Canada. So Canada's food guide, the revamp in 2019, is now, instead of a printed document that you would need to access, is now supposed to be a resource, a suite of resource online. And that includes the snapshot, which is like an image of like the plate and how like the proportions are supposed to be. And that comes with a lot of like recipes and tricks and tips and how like to implement this. I don't know if we have like any kind of data on how people are aware of Canada's food guide, and specifically the eating practices ones. I feel like people are probably more familiar with the plate snapshot and the fact that the food groups are gone. There was a lot of like, things about the dairy group being like gone and all of that. I know that got people reacting, but in terms of the eating practices, I'm not sure if people are aware that even there's like that new addition to the food guide. I hope it's communicated well. And I know there's some evidence, I wouldn't say it's Canadian data, but like, subgroups of like different people in different regions. For example, Well Family Health Study has been doing that type of work where they try to understand the perceptions of different groups, be parents of young kids or the kids themselves, on the food guide. And it's interesting to see what comes up with this, right? I remember the one like where they looked at the perception of children on the food guide, and like a bit of like to the point of Kamila about like food literacy, which is also an interest of mine. People, specifically children, do not know what like a protein food is, and like they don't know what a banana is classified as. So like we have much kind of foundational problems in a sense, or area of improvement. And in terms of how that is translated in public health policies, so the interesting thing is that Canada, we have this food guide that's Canadian, but then each of the provinces and the territories in the country have their own kind of like directions in terms of how to do health and how to implement that, and what kind of like public health programs they want to put forward in their provinces. So that can go in all directions. So that's kind of difficult, because even putting the Canada's food guide in like long-term care facility guidelines, that will like vary vastly between provinces. And I think the innovative change of removing the portions and removing the number of portion per days and food groups, that has like made some organization unsecured as to how to implement this and how to make that concretely in like their programs. So I think that's an area, and ours is maybe a bit more new than like in Brazil. So I think we're still kind of refining how to implement this and make it work. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so almost in the same direction, we have a question for Kamila, which is, in your opinion, do you think that the Brazilian population knows about the guide, about the Brazilian dietary guidelines? And do you think that there could be like a way for people to get to know these guidelines for the majority of the population? So Jacqueline asked about it. So almost the same question, but now looking at our situation back home.
So it's a great question for sure. Yes, in Brazil, what we have is that the Ministry of Health, when the food guide was released, the Ministry of Health permitted many partnerships with institutions like universities and other institutions to create tools and methods to develop ways of implement the food guide. So this tool that we developed, that I presented here, it's part of this of one of these partnerships with the University of São Paulo. And besides this tool, this measurement tool, we also created within the same project short videos that are in YouTube for to summarize the main recommendations of the guide, a short version of the food guide, a protocol to implement in public primary healthcare services. So a lot of effort. This is only one of the partnerships with our university, and there was other ones too. So there was a huge effort to implement, and we don't have in our national service a question asking, do you know, have you heard about the food guide? But what we have is that we have been observing between the national service before and after the food guide that there was a stagnation of the intake of ultra-processed foods in some groups of the population, while in other groups there was the increasing trend keep going the same as it was before the guide. So this suggests that it's working. Maybe the recommendations of the food guide are arriving for specific groups of the population, mainly the most educated people, while for other groups of the population, maybe it should be more new efforts more directed to the subgroups, or to remove other barriers for healthy diet, because maybe only information is not enough for them to achieve a healthy diet. So yeah, I think this answered the question. I don't know.
Yes, thank you. And Marcy keeps asking other questions. She asked, do you educate pupils about the Brazilian guidelines at Brazilian schools? I think this is a very interesting topic because, as far as I know, in Canada, there's no school feeding program, but there are guidelines that children must be taught about food and what is healthy eating, but at the same time, they're not offered that option, which is different from what we have in Brazil. So maybe you start, Kamila, if you I don't know if you want to expand on that, how those guidelines are applied towards children and their environment in schools, and then Maud can complete on that in Canada.
Okay, thanks for the question. I think we have two main ways through which the recommendations of the food guide are being implemented in schools. One of them is through the books. Since the beginning, or one of the first actions was to introduce recommendations of the guideline in the scholar books for kids. So the new books that comes from the government to public schools include recommendations of the food guide. So so that kids can see and discuss in classes with teachers. And the other way is that we have a big school feeding program in Brazil, the PNAE. And recently, I think not more so recently, it was 2020. It seems that 2020 was like yesterday, but it's been 3 years. In 2020, the new law, the new regulation for the school feeding program includes the recommendations of the guide, establishing a limit to inclusion of ultra-processed foods in the menus of the schools. So we already had before, like, limit for nutrients or for sugar, for example, but not for ultra-processed foods, and that allowed to include, although limiting sugar, there was no limit for ultra-processed foods, and now it is already established. So I think this is the two main ways through which the food guide are being implemented in the schools.
Which vastly differ from Canada because we do not have a school, like nutrition school program. I think it goes again to show the education, just like health, is the responsibility of each provinces. So that, I don't know if that explains why we don't have anything or why it's so difficult to have a unified program across the country. I guess there's also a lot of like geographical differences when we think about the provinces, but also the territories, which are really north. And that brings the question of the food system and how to also make sure that, you know, most of our Indigenous people are up north. They're obviously overall the country, but I think the territories are different than the reality in the south of the country. And I think it goes to show also back to kind of the public health efforts and the Canada's food guide. I think the guide itself is disseminated in classrooms and children are exposed to it. But then the modeling, right, which can be very powerful, of what is served in cafeterias, in school, in any kind of activities they partake in. Is there any rules? Sometimes it's up to the school. Sometimes it's up to the, I don't know, like the council of parents who are involved in the school. So I think it relies a lot on people who are just very dedicated to the cause, but sometimes don't have all the resources to really make a big impact, which is a shame because children could learn from early on and kind of make that as their norm and what hopefully tastes good and kind of is what they expect for the rest of their life. But I think it also brings another kind of question or area for me of interest burden is that the role of adults, right? Because sometimes we see adults being like, well, this is food guide, or this is the recommendation, serve this food, serve this kind of plate. Kamila, you showed a nice example. And it's like you expect children to just kind of eat that and problem solve, and it's not. And I think there's not that kind of guidelines at the national level, again, in public health, as to how do we teach children how to eat, essentially. So the distinction between eating and feeding, which I don't think is very much discussed, and how it's actually challenging. It's a learning process. So I think that's perhaps also an area of public health and national guidelines that could be a bit stronger to really support people in making health changes. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. That's another research gap, like how to assess with children, right? Okay, we have a question from our camera in the Faculdade de Saúde Pública in the School of Public Health, please.
Yes, we have one. Okay. Hello, my name is Thais. I'm a PhD student here in the School of Public Health, and I would like to know if you analyze the association between your scale about food practice and the healthy eating food index that was developed recently
in Canada.
In Canada.
So I'm not sure I fully understood because of the echo. So you're asking if we have seen association between our screener and the HEFI screener? Correct. I kind of alluded to this earlier, and we did try to see if it was associated, if in a same population of participants who've completed those two screeners at the same time, if we could see an association. And we only have preliminary data, and it was not showing that there would be an association. And in listening to Kamila, I was reflecting that our eating practices, and I can perhaps share my screen again, you have them here, and all of these could technically be done by eating a lot of transformed, like ultra processed food, or like, you know, food that has low quality. And I don't know if that explains why we didn't see any of like no significant association. Obviously there's preliminary data, so it could be more powerful in a bigger sample, but reflecting on like the great results that Kamila showed, and how we did not see any kind of like trend of any sorts. I was thinking maybe it's because you could do all of this, you could enjoy you could cook more, but with transformed food, you could enjoy your food, but it's very like low quality. And I wonder if that explains why. And it comes to like kind of like the nature of the eating habit recommendation we have in our guide. Just something I was kind of reflecting on the go as Kamila was talking, but I don't know if that answers your question, as we did not do a formal kind of like analysis. Might be in the future. It would still be interesting to see if in subgroup, obviously we would love to see an impact on the diet quality that would make it like even more powerful to be like both on your relationship with food and on your diet quality. Following these recommendations will have a great impact, but I don't think we can say that yet for sure.
Okay, are we happy with that answer? Any other questions from Saúde Pública? Okay.
Oh, no, I have one, please. Just to complete this debate about the correlation with the eating. Do you think the problem might be the size of the sample? Because if I'm sure it's a very little sample, so probably if you could apply for another sample could be correlated.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with you. We like had hoped to do more testing, and we didn't have the power, like the statistical power, due to this small sample size. And I think there's more work to be done in like a larger sample with more diversity in French and in English to also even compare this. So I totally agree with you. And that's why I would be hesitant in saying there's no association or it's not linked. I just don't think we have the data to say either or. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
And expanding a little bit more about the sample from Dr. Mold's study, Ana Carolina Leme asked, how did you screen for health literacy in the sample, as most participants might have scored high for health literacy, and this might have skewed the results a bit. Was that a concern?
Hi, Carolina. Yeah, absolutely. We tried to have a diversity again in level of health literacy, and we ended up having people with a very high level of health literacy. We measured that with, I think it's the vital health questionnaires, and it was an online. So again, like, do people with low health literacy or even low literacy kind of just prefer not to complete the questionnaire and kind of like not participate? Is that like a barrier we should try to overcome in a different way? I'm wondering, because indeed, if we have a lot of people with high health literacy, or we had like an exclusion criteria of like obviously not having a university or any kind of nutrition background, but if you are more prone to find the subject interesting, perhaps you're more health conscious, and then all of that kind of like taint your results. So yeah, that's always the challenge in trying to recruit, and then having a smaller sample size than what expected, and then obviously a bit less diversity that we would have liked to have.
Perfect, thank you. I think now we're moving on to a hot topic, I'd say, which is de novo classification, because you're talking directly to the Nupens group, right? I'll start with Kamila. So Teresa asked, well, she says, thank you for the nice presentations. And she asked, Kamila, do you know how the term ultra-processed foods is understood by the Brazilian population?
Thank you, Teresa, for the question. We also don't have any study investigating if people know how this term specifically means in Brazil. But there was an interesting study when other countries were trying to included the term of the novel classification, their food guides. There's an example of Uruguay, and they conducted a study before including the term ultra-processed food in their guide, and they asking like a qualitative study, asking people if they know, if they could describe what ultra-processed foods are, and they find that people can bring like main examples of ultra-processed food and saying that a main characteristics like a description that is compatible with the technical definition of ultra-processed food. So food processing, people know what it is. In the term ultra, people also know. So it's expected that the general population, people might can conceptualize what it is. And I think our results in terms of the change from the national surveys, the consumption of these foods is showing that people can identify what the guide is saying in terms of which food should be avoided. So yeah, but I agree that in a study focusing on exploring how this term is well understood in the population would be interesting.
That's when a very good food labeling in front of package labeling comes in hand, trying to translate information so people can understand what ultra-processed means, right? We have a question from Saúde, Pública.
Yes. We know that food intake is determined by a range of factors, not just for individual habits. So in my opinion, this kind of scale that looks at eating behaviors or habits might be very useful for health promotion intervention as a way to evaluate process more than impact, because we know that impact might be caused for different factors. So I would like to know if the Canadian scale has been used in intervention studies as well, not just for epidemiological studies.
It hasn't yet. I think the idea, obviously, we were wanting to validate it before disseminating, and we're kind of at that stage trying to publish it, and then in partnership with Health Canada to disseminate and make it accessible for researchers and others to access on their website. But I can see that as being kind of the next step to exactly measure if during an intervention we can see, and that can be becoming a tool that is used for that purpose, and also in research, but perhaps in like different public health settings or medical teams wanting to measure quickly things and assess the impact that it can be or have on different subgroups. Yeah, so I think we might get there, but we're a bit too early.
Thank you. Marcy also asked about why is the term ultra not used in Canada? So I don't know if that's if that's an easy answer, but I'd say in your opinion, right, in your researcher's point of view, what do you think about using the NOVA classification, and how is it translated or not into the Canada's food guide?
I don't know if I can speak to that. I'm definitely not a NOVA expert, so I could not really propose any kind of answers. I don't know if, Kamila, you have more thoughts, more formed thoughts on this than me.
No, I think I also cannot answer why Canada didn't adopt the term ultra-processed food, but instead adopted highly processed food, right? But it's in a way address the same group of foods. I mean, maybe not with the same definition we have for ultra-processed food, but I think it's different decisions when building the recommendations, and I don't have any propriety to say to what is the difference between the two terms, like what covers highly processed food covers different from ultra processed.
Okay, I think one of the main lessons that I'm going to take from the presentations today is that more than just the food itself, but obviously the ways and everything, it's so important as the food, and that's why it is incorporated in those screening tools from both countries. And it's not a big coincidence, it's the data and the research that's been produced that it's showing that that is a very important thing to measure, and that's the big challenge, how to, right? So okay, so we just have another question from Lourenço Alves. What's your opinion about the role of the marginalization of the food culture of traditional peoples and the impact of replacing traditional ingredients and preparations with ultra-processed foods. I think that can be applied for both contexts. If you want to start, Kamila.
Okay, can you just read the question again, please?
Yes, of course. So what's your opinion about the role of the marginalization of the food culture of traditional peoples and the impact of replacing traditional ingredients and preparations with ultra-processed foods? The nutrition transition, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's this is mainly important in traditional dietary patterns, traditional cultures, because I would mention that the marketing of ultra-processed food has an important impact on this, like not only the marginalization of this traditional dietary patterns, but the marketing or the big investment that the food industry makes on trying to make these foods more attractive and important for, I would say mainly for young people. So the transition, for intergenerations, it's important for keeping traditional dietary patterns, and for specific cultures, it's important to keep through the generations, and the marketing focus specifically for young people maybe has an impact on that. I don't know if I answered the question, but I hope maybe we can bring more to discuss this point if they want.
It's a loaded question, right? There's a lot at play, and I think it speaks to decolonization. We definitely have that in Canada, and I think there's efforts to name that and also address that. And we have some of the recommendations that do mention the importance of being true and honoring your culture and your food traditions. I think the other thing is Canada's food guide in our case is one public health strategy, but there needs to be others. And in terms of ultra transformed or highly transformed food and sugary drinks, for example, well, we have some of our Indigenous communities who don't have access to fresh water. So are we really blaming the highly transformed food here, or we have a bigger problem? So I think we have to have other strategies and have the guide as one, but also a broader kind of social net to really solve these problems. But I think it's good that it's incorporated in the food guide and that we have that on our radar, that there's the Eurocentric way of eating, and that's not the only way. And I think having a bit of that diversity, and it starts with the language use, I think that's a first good step. It's not sufficient, but it's the first good step.
Definitely. We have a question from Saúde, Pública.
Again, sorry, but I'm using this opportunity to learn more with Lord and Kamila. Looking for these two experiences, Brazilian and Canadian experience, to develop scales that we're thinking to use in the process of implementation of national dietary guidelines. I think there is a specific point comparing these two experiences. It's in terms of psychometrical measures, is that in the Brazilian scale, we decided to use an approach that considers 4 dimensions of eating practices. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the Canadian scale just used 1 dimension. So I think it could be interesting, Kamila, say a little bit more why we decided to consider 4 dimensions in our scale, and Mode, if you could explain a little bit more why not the different dimensions were considered during the validation process, please.
Oh, I think I can start. Thank you, Patricia, for the question. Yeah, I think the main reason for us to have 4 dimensions was because due to the method we adopted to develop and validate the tool. So we started with a big pool of items, as I explained it, but not in detail. So thanks for the opportunity to explore this a bit more. We had more than 90 items, 92 from the beginning. And then we explored which dimensions were covered by this set of items using statistical analysis. So we used exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis to understand what our items were measuring. So we first used exploratory analysis to reduce the number of items, and then we got to this version with 24 items, and explore this within a confirmatory factor analysis to understand exactly what our tool was measuring. So that's was when we conceptualized these 4 dimensions, which are planning, domestic organization, eating modes, and food choices, and could understand like the measurement more in detail. But as you said, Maude, in our case, we all also recommend to use the scale as a whole and not the dimensions separately. But we can see it's more to have an idea, more deep idea of our measurement. So I also was wondering about asking this to Maude, so it's nice to have this opportunity to discuss if you have considered to use factor analysis to identify the dimensionality.
Yeah, we did. We had planned on doing it. And again, to the sample size point, we didn't have the power to do it. So I think it's a really it's a real strength of yours. And I think that would be the future step for ours, because it would make it much more powerful. And I think the sample size in that case and the limits on resources, financial and time kind of like stopped us there. But I think also perhaps, I don't know like what we would have discovered and like how far we would have pushed that. I think it would have been nice to do it. It was the plan. Now reality has been different, but I think seeing yours specifically, that's really nice how you have that in the 4 dimensions. And I see how people will probably be tempted to use one of the 4 dimensions. So I appreciate you mentioning it's not designed this way. You use the 4 as a whole, but yeah, I think it would be really nice to have a bigger pool of participants and do the full and the retest, which we had also planned on doing, and we just didn't have enough power to really have any conclusions there either.
Okay, we have another question. Were the instruments used able to cover environmental factors that could affect adherence to the guidelines in the guide, such as extensive supply of ultra-processed products around schools? I think Canada's, Dr. Mould mentioned Canada's food marketing aspect of it, but Kamila can also comment on the Brazilian side.
Yes, for sure. Yes, this environmental dimension in our guidelines is not one specific recommendation, but it's through all the recommendations. So it's a transversal, cross-sectional principle of our guide. So all the recommendations, all their messages in the food guide take into account the environmental impact of eating. So this means that this recommendation is also covered in the items because they were based on this recommendation. So for example, we have items in the scale asking if people prefer to buy foods and local from local farmers, for example, which is for sure a recommendation that covers the environmental aspect. Also for organic foods. Yes, I could mention these 2 examples now that comes to my mind, but yes, we are covering the environmental aspect in our tool.
I don't think ours does as much. I think the only item is that to be aware that food marketing can influence your choices, but I mean, that can be an ad I see on TV and I'm not necessarily in that environment, or it can be the opposite. I don't watch TV, but I'm surrounded by restaurants around where I work. So I don't think we cover this and we can infer anything. I think yours in Brazil, perhaps it covers a bit more largely all the steps and not just the preparation of food, eating food, and kind of like perhaps what we're more focused on. Something to add to the next iteration of the guide and the screener.
Adriani, I hope that answers your question. And we're coming to an end of our session, and we received a question, Tata, asked about the Brazilian guide, that it's of such an important reference. How can we make this to reach the society as a whole? And I would conclude the questions with that answer. Like we have we heard today an amazing work and studies with the effort of designing and screening tool for both populations, and it's such an important issue, such an important reference for public policies, and maybe like a final touch on that from both sides. How can we apply all of that knowledge towards a healthier environment and promote healthy eating?
That's a hard question to end. That's a hard question. I think it goes from these kind of talks where we reflect collectively on tools and how to measure adherence to things more practically. And I think about food literacy and how we can make sure people have skills, but also the food system to have access to like fresh produce. So I don't think I have an answer, but I share the importance of continuing to do that work to ultimately impact society.
Yeah, I agree totally with Maud. It's a hard question because it's hard to change, but I think we are things are changed. We have new food guides that brought a lot of good innovations, like considering food processing, considering environmental aspects, considering food practices as well. So I think a good thing to have in mind is that important not only to use these food guides as tools to communicate or as an educational instrument in each country, but use them to inform public policies to change. For example, the example that I mentioned in Brazil, the application of the recommendations in the school feeding program by limiting the intake of ultra-processed food, but it also should be used for policies in other sectors in order to change the system. So I think I could say that, like, besides using as an educational tool, also consider that they should inform public policies in a more broad way.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was a challenge as the last question, but we had to end at some point. So I want to thank once again Dr. Maud Perrault and Kamila Gabe for teaching us a lot about both food guides and the screening tools. And I also would like to thank and especially acknowledge to FAPESP, the São Paulo Research Foundation, for the funding for Kamila's research. And since I'm here, I'm going to say for mine too, because I'm here under their grant too. So stay tuned. That's soon. People could receive more information about the next webinar, which will occur on May 17th until further notice. And the next topic will be web-based epidemiological studies and their potential to inform public policies, with Dr. David Hammond and Dr. Eurydice Steele. Dr. Hammond will present the International Food Policy Study, which is a multi-country cross-sectional study with data from 6 different countries. And Dr. Steele will present the Nutrinet Brasil. Kamila mentioned a little bit about the study today, but that's a very good and gigantic project from the Brazilian side. I would definitely watch this, which is a cohort study coordinated by Nupens in Brazil. So once again, thank you for joining in, and the speakers showed their contact, and I think they would be delighted to receive questions on email too. Okay, thank you so much. Obrigada, gente. Tchau, tchau.
Bye. Thank you.